6 minutes past 7 GMT. Welcome to Weekend from the BBC World Service with me, Julian Worricker. At COP29, there's obviously a lot of talk about climate change, but for these words to spur people into meaningful action, the language used matters. And we turned to discuss that to Lee Krimble, who's a behavioural linguist in Johannesburg, South Africa, to describe the role the use of language can play in more effective communication about the climate crisis.
The language and communication element's so critical. And the thing about behavioral linguistics, so that's a new field of communication, which is really rooted in how people process information, how they form some type of viewpoint, and then ultimately make a decision to act in some way. And the language connected to that is just so powerful. What we're finding, and certainly we've been following a lot of what's happening at COP29 ourselves, is through the powerful use of language, and this transcends geographics, demographics, linguistics, these behavioral principles are so innate to all types of people. And so by really speaking to people on a level that resonates with them, that's relevant to them, we found that this means that the communication is so much more effective and persuasive.
Give us some examples. What works in this context? What doesn't?
We've been quite interested in some exciting changes in news reporting when it comes to style guides. So the New York Times, for example, they've started to change up their semantics, and semantics and word choice is a critical pillar of behavioral linguistics, because we know people use language to make sense of the world and how we see things. And so they've changed style guides such that we no longer refer to biodiversity in our news reporting. It's wildlife, because, we care more about wildlife than something that maybe is a bit more distanced and scientific, like biodiversity. And global warming, we're now seeing reference to global heating. The argument there is warming's quite nice. And certainly in the Northern Hemisphere, you're going into your winter months now. Warming's lovely. Heating is a little bit more urgent. It's a little bit more uncomfortable. And so referring to global heating has more of an impact language-wise. And certainly our favorite example, not referring to climate change, but climate crisis or climate emergency. And we're paying close attention to the articles globally coming out of COP29 to see to what extent news reporting is using some of these linguistic tools to help drive this urgency and make it more of a now issue.
With words like crisis and emergency, clearly it feels like a crisis or an emergency if you are living through something horrendous, which is obviously a result of climate change. It might not if you're not going through that experience. And is that a risk in the way one communicates here?
It's a tricky balance, because mainstream media, where you're speaking to mass groups of people and you're going with the climate emergency or climate crisis messaging, that's important because of a behavioral principle called the present bias. So despite us thinking we really care about our future selves, there's been a lot of research to show we don't really. And so to get people to think about things that maybe aren't impacting them yet in their present lived worlds is a bit of a challenge. And in fact, a great example, the BBC, you did an article a while back about how your stereotypical image of the polar bear on an ice cap is just not cutting it anymore. Few people are relating to that. In fact, it's probably been so overused because of how shocking it was at the time that we're having a bit of an ostrich effect now and ignoring it. And so the advice there is we're needing visuals that are closer to home, of weather events that are on our doorstep. Valencia recently had the huge flooding, the wildfires in Australia. Pick a country, we can find something that climate change is having some type of impact on. And those are the types of images and the messaging that really need to be upweighted.
Does the communication over temperature rises and temperature limits, and obviously much is made of the 1.5 degrees figure and where that takes the world, does that help understanding, or does that confuse people, do you think?
If you're chatting to scientists or academics, maybe that would resonate. But we found that stories and storytelling is far, far more important and impactful to make things relevant with, again, people's lived experiences.
Lee Krimble, a behavioural linguist in Johannesburg, South Africa.